Good morning and happy Tuesday. Happy foggy Tuesday. Isn't that gorgeous? Honestly, I'm usually not up this early, or at least I'm not out of bed or out of my house this early. I'm not a morning person, but I'm concerned a little bit that the Tromboncino Squash in the greenhouse won't receive adequate pollination if I'm not here to do it. And this is actually the first female blossom that I have seen open. Look at the size of this pre-fruit fruit here. I've never seen a immature fruit of any plant that blooms this way be that big initially. This has me really excited for how big these things are going to get when they mature. Hopefully our frosts will hold out long enough for this squash to get big enough for us to harvest as a winter squash. But first we have to pollinate. Oh look, there's another one. So here we have a male flower. It's just got a stem. It doesn't have a baby version of a fruit. And inside here is some pollen. Now, I haven't done much hand pollinating in my short gardening life, but something tells me that that's probably sufficient. So it's no secret to anyone that my greenhouse is pretty darn full. It's a little bit chaotic, it's a little bit weedy, and thus far it really hasn't been a big problem. Right now some things are kind of starting to die. It's about that time of year, so I do need to clean it out, but I haven't weeded alongside the edge of the greenhouse all year, and it hasn't been a big problem. It doesn't bother me at all, but it's presented a problem for my greenhouse. So exhibit A, this is the worst corner that I have. I've got a little tub here that kind of started out as a compost heap, an unofficial compost heap. But behind it, you see this knotweed, there's some grass and whatever. This area here actually caused one of the pests that we've been having break into the greenhouse, a possum, to literally crawl through the plastic to get out of the greenhouse. Yep, and I noticed this yesterday. So I've been pretty sure, and I'm sure this is the case, that the possums are entering the greenhouse through the side here. For some reason, that possum got spooked and got lost in the weeds, couldn't find its way out, so it chewed its way out on the end wall. And the way that our greenhouse is constructed is the way that we were taught to put on the plastic. There's a specific order that I guess makes sense for putting on the plastic. So we have our shade cloth, so it's gonna be a little hard to see. But the plastic is wedged in here with this channel and then some basically locking wire inside the channel. So we have our top piece on second and the bottom piece went on first. So in theory, to replace the whole side of this greenhouse, we would have to take off the shade cloth, which we will eventually anyways, but the top piece and then the side piece. So I think we're gonna opt for a patch. So I'll be sharing that a little bit later in the video. I do have a lot more to do in the greenhouse, but before the rain really starts coming down, I am going to plant some of the seedlings that we started a couple weeks ago. And these seedlings, I actually almost killed. So I brought these seedlings outside earlier in the week so that I could acclimate them to the full sun. This past week has been on and off with cloud cover, and that's the perfect time to try to introduce seedlings outside. You have to worry about them much less with intermittent cloud cover than you do if you have, let's say, a week of complete blasting full sun. A lot of times plants need basically a timeout from full sun as they're getting used to it, or they will burn. I sort of forgot about them because I wasn't babysitting them, trying to get them in and out of the sun at certain intervals. And I had pulled them out of this tray that they're in right now, this 1020 tray. And because of that, they dried out pretty quickly. I mean, these cells are really small, and I honestly thought that these seedlings were goners. They were laying over and really wilted. I'm really glad we got them to bounce back. So on this tray, I have lettuce, I have dill, and over here are some calendula flowers. And on this side, I have a couple different varieties of kale. It looks like I have spinaches, and I forget what's on this end. I need to look at my chart, but I'll probably leave it in there until I remember what that is, because I don't remember. So if it happens to work out in your schedule to transplant out seedlings right before rain, it works out really well because you don't have to come back and water them. You can see a little bit of evidence of some of the wilted leaves, but these things will be okay. I'm actually growing this lettuce for head lettuce, so in keeping that in mind, I want to space them appropriately. Usually when I grow lettuce just for baby greens, I will scatter the seed and keep the plants pretty small, but with head lettuce, I want to plant one plant per square foot. Give the same spacing to the kale varieties that I have here. I have dinosaur kale and a little bit of scarlet kale. I'm gonna plant the spinach a little bit closer together, probably right around 6 to 8 inches apart. This here is actually a potato plant that popped up. There's a couple more potato plants that are coming up in this bed, and I'm gonna let them do their thing. There's not enough time left in the season for these potatoes to really produce a good crop, but those tubers, the potatoes that are underground, will come back next spring and we'll get a bonus crop out of it. The rest of what's in here, I looked it up. This is cabbage that I planted, dill, and a couple of the calendula flowers. These are destined for the greenhouse, so I'm going to leave them in here for right now. Much of the rest of the raised bed garden is pretty sad looking. Our melon bed, I've pretty much let go. My plan for this is actually to let things die back and then pile up the dead vines and things into the bed and then put some manure and other amendments on top of that and let this bed rest for the winter. I'm doing a very similar thing over here with our bean beds. This has been the bean strip for almost the entire season. And what I'm going to be doing here, it's technically called chop and drop. So beans are very great at adding in nitrogen into your soil. They actually remove it out of the air with their leaves and can impregnate the soil with it with their roots. And a really great way to make sure all of that nitrogen stays in the soil is to actually compost the plants down straight into the bed. So most of these plants are sick and done, and all I'm going to be doing, instead of just pulling up the plants and either feeding them to my animals or composting them elsewhere, is literally just chopping them and dropping them straight in the bed so that they can decompose over winter and add fuel to next year's garden. A lot of these pole beans I have let go to seed. You see how fat and crazy they look? These are a very special heirloom seed to me, so I am wanting to save as many of these as I can. They're not quite ready to put in a bag right now. They're still pretty wet and juicy, but you see how big these seeds are? These are going to be awesome. So what I can do is actually lay these out on my dehydrator trays, put them in the dehydrator with it off, and just let them air dry in there. There is the option for leaving the pod on the vine until the pod completely dries out, but at this point, these are fine and can be dried inside. Someone may want to do this instead of waiting for the pods to dry out, just to make sure that they don't get any mold introduced. Or another reason you might want to do that is to gather your seed before wild critters get to it. Speaking of gathering seed before the wild critters get to it, I'm actually surprised that our sunflower head here is relatively untouched. There's a small little section on the edge there that has a little bit of seed missing, but look at how gorgeous this is. So at this point, the back of the sunflower head is starting to turn yellow. I could cut this off here and dry it out inside and save it for feed for our animals for winter. I've actually elected to leave all the sunflower heads out in the garden to feed the wild birds. They'll find it eventually. Right now, there's still a lot of wild forage out there. The asparagus bed over here is really starting to show the true sign of the season. Those asparagus stalks that fanned out into these large, lovely ferns all summer have done their job throughout the course of the summer, and it's time for them to put that energy down into the crown of the asparagus plant and die back. So they've been dying back pretty regularly. I'm going to wait until they die back fully before I remove these fronds and then amend this bed for the winter as well. There's actually a lot of life happening in this back bed. Our Swiss chard has gained a second wind after a really, really hot summer. Our opal basil is honestly almost ready for us to make our first harvest and our first batch of freezer pesto. Stay tuned for that. And over here we had, oh, I've got a mushroom. Lots of mushrooms. So I actually don't know anything about mushrooms, so I'm not going to be harvesting these and eating these. But I do know that oftentimes mushrooms in your beds means that you have a really good environment going on underneath the soil. Our dill is looking lovely. I've actually taken a harvest off of the dill already. I love it so much. And our volunteer lettuce, look at it. Look how big it is. I had quite a few lettuces in this bed early in the year that once it started to get really hot, they went to flower and went to seed, as they do. And I often get lettuce plants volunteering in the garden around this time. And honestly, sometimes those seeds overwinter and I get bonus lettuce plants in the spring too. I actually made a community post the other day talking about my bonus tomato plant that's growing in my greenhouse that I didn't plant, but we have gotten probably nearly a gallon of really small spoon-sized yellow tomatoes off of.
Oh, I have tomatoes for breakfast.
I was just marveling at how a plant that I didn't really intentionally grow had done so well despite really not being cared for. It just grew and produced because that's what seeds are designed to do. I thought that that picture was just really beautiful, and I did have one person kind of take it the wrong way. They assumed that I was saying that free-range plants are better than plants that are intentionally planted. Clearly that's not the case, but there is something that is just beautiful about getting food where you honestly didn't expect it. A lot of work goes into gardening. This is not necessarily an easy thing. And so when something can grow and produce that you didn't have to work super hard for, I think that that's worth celebrating. I love volunteer plants, and whenever I can, I like to make space for them to grow in the garden. We have this lettuce plant, we have several different tomatoes that volunteered throughout the year, and I have those potatoes. That's bonus food that I didn't expect to get, that I didn't really have to work hard for. It's not necessarily at all more nutritious or anything like that, but it's something I didn't plan on that I still get to benefit from. The ground cherries over here are an example of something that we did plant here one year, but I haven't planted them here in about 2 years, but they keep coming back. And as far as I know, ground cherries being a nightshade, they're kind of like a potato, but not, as far as I know, there's not a tuber underground that comes back. The way that they come back is they're little berries. Once they mature, they turn brown in these husks and they mature into these beautiful yellow, very fruity, almost mango tomatoey flavored berries. Delicious. They ripen and they're super easy to knock off the plant, and they're super easy to kind of lose in the soil, and I think that's part of the design. They very readily reseed, and I'm not complaining. Eventually, I would love for this raised bed garden to be essentially a perennial garden where things like this happen, and I don't really have to plan for it necessarily. I mean, you obviously still have to take care of your garden space, but a perennial garden is a lot more hands-off, where you just kind of have things like strawberries, blackberries that are behind me, these ground cherries, things like asparagus and rhubarb. Just a more hands-off situation in the raised bed garden is an eventual goal for me. The greenhouse, though, that is pretty reliably going to be pretty hands-on. And one of the reasons that I haven't dealt with things like this weedy corner is because of our wasp situation. It's been pretty intense. They like these weedy corners. I should have honestly kept on top of this much earlier in the season. I had planned on just leaving it until the first frost, and then all the wasps would be dead and I could really get in there without a problem. But obviously I don't need any more holes punched in my greenhouse because of possums or anything else. So I've got to take care of at least this corner today. I'm going to stick you on a time lapse, and this corner should look a lot better very shortly, and hopefully I don't get stung.
How come the stars come to shine when it's dark from so far away and show us where we are? What makes the sun go to sleep every night, and what's it dreaming of? I wonder. How come the sky sometimes hides behind the clouds? Maybe it's just like me, a little bit scared of heights. Why does the rain always keep on pouring down when it's gray outside? It really makes me wonder.
Well, this corner certainly looks much, much better. Now, it is true that a lot of people, when they're initially setting up their greenhouse, will place weed fabric underneath the baseboard around the whole edge of the greenhouse to keep the weeds out and away from the edge of the greenhouse, and hopefully they won't make their way in. That is a very effective way to do things. When we set up this greenhouse, our plan was to run pigs through here and to run animals through this space intermittently throughout the lifetime of this greenhouse. That's why we've got the hog panel in here. And I knew that having that weed fabric under the edge was going to be a problem with animals in here. The pigs were really going to tear it up, and it just didn't make sense for our plans. I do need to take much better care of the weeds on the edge of the greenhouse, but I'm not exactly the best weeder. It's just who I am. I knew this was going to be a thing. Unfortunately, I paid the price with a little bit of damage in the greenhouse, but we're going to be able to fix that right up. That's actually not the first hole that has been punched through the greenhouse. There's a couple spots right up here. I'll see if I can get it to come through. It's a little bit hard to see with the shade cloth on top, but that was put in the greenhouse before we really had the whole thing put together. And it's okay. That kind of thing happens. So when we first put the first hole in the greenhouse, I went ahead and bought some of this greenhouse repair tape. Holes in the plastic is a thing. That's why they make this. It's 4 inches wide, and I think we're only going to need 2, maybe 3 strips to fix the problem.
2.
2?
Yeah.
Like it? How's it look?
Should work.
Okay. Well, that patch isn't the most beautiful thing, but it's going to do for the time being. Greenhouse plastic is actually replaced right around every 4 years, so before we know it, this whole greenhouse will be basically brand new.